Here we are meeting online this morning. We are still in Winchester. So Amy's sister, this is a big weekend for her. She and Glenn gotten married this weekend, and we, of course, after weddings, we always travel back on Saturday night. This week, we haven't needed to do that for obvious reasons. So I'm coming to you from Winchester this morning. This has been a week unlike anything that any of us have ever seen. So welcome, DCCers. I'm happy that you're joining us this morning. And for those who might be listening in or watching for the first time, I want to welcome you, and we're just going to consider you part of our extended family this morning. And you are welcome to join us anytime, physically or online, listening to our podcast. We'd love to have you. So, what a bizarre week. It's a concerning week. It's been a stressful week. There have been some strange things happening this week. And I think it's safe to say none of us have ever seen anything like this. So 3 days ago, I had a pretty strong thought about what's going on with this virus and our reactions to it and natural, serious concerns about it. And this thought, I really have believed that I was supposed to share this with you. So I'm going to just say this, guys. I'm going to share it unapologetically. And in the end, my hope is that you'll not only be encouraged, but also, if you're not sure of God's voice, if God's voice exists, or if it's real, or is a voice of hope, my hope is that you'll hear God's heart and voice in these next few minutes. So while we should take this virus seriously, I'm particularly concerned about a couple of friends who are currently on chemotherapy. I know that doctors and facilities are working with patients battling cancer right now to keep them quarantined and safe. Obviously, we're concerned about the elderly. While all of that is a very real concern, I'm positive that God does not want us to be gripped with fear and anxiety. I'm pretty positive that this anxiety shouldn't be part of our lives. And I'm going to say that again. I don't believe this hysterical, fearful gripping of our hearts and of our nation should be a part of what's happening. As a reminder, God tells us that his followers should be anxious for nothing. And when I was young in my faith and I would read that or hear that, I really pushed back on God on that. Like, you've got to be kidding, anxious for nothing. So I've grown to a point in my own faith where I feel pretty strongly about that. It's something I practice. I haven't mastered it. There are times where anxiety grips me, certainly. But I want to talk to you for a few minutes about what I've practiced and how this has become more and more of my reality, where I've seen anxiety be less a part of my life. I've said for years that I think worry and anxiety kind of runs through our blood and our family. And it's something that I can default to. And I think that's probably true of a lot of us. So for just a little bit here, I want to talk about the practical. Like, how do we actually live out lives where we are anxious for nothing, or anxious for less and less and less, and have more and more peace and calm? A few things about this virus, the coronavirus, that we know. Here are a couple of things that we know. We know it's contagious. It seems to be very contagious. It spreads easily. We know it's gone global. In just 2 or 3 months, it's become a pandemic. It's on 6 continents. A few things that we know that I find really encouraging: it's mysteriously affecting very few to virtually no children. And doctors are still baffled by that. Reading even late last night again about that, still there isn't a real clear answer on why this new virus strand doesn't seem to be affecting children as new viruses often do. The swine flu was a big deal, H1N1 in 2009. And I remember it. I remember that there was a lot of concern. We didn't know what the effects were going to be. But we got through it. Within 2 months of it being diagnosed in a young girl in California, it became a global pandemic. And then 2 months later, by August of 2009, it was virtually over. and we got back to life. It affected some people, but it didn't wipe out our country. It didn't wipe out communities. And there wasn't the mass hysteria of large gatherings of people closing. I think there's safety in that, and I think there's wisdom. But I also think we can all agree from what we're seeing on social media that there's hysteria, or there has been hysteria about this week. And so, what's the difference? I think there are definitely some things that stand out. We're in a digital age now that wasn't as prevalent 11 years ago. I think when somebody has been diagnosed with the virus in New Jersey, everybody knows that, like within minutes, and we're speculating. What does that mean? I think in more traditional media in the past, something's reported and then there's more context to it. I think that's fed some of our hysteria, just how easily accessible so much information is at our hands. But spiritually, this is what I know is happening spiritually, is that what we've been seeing this week, to me, seems like a macro picture of what can happen inside of us individually on a regular basis. Some of us feel anxiety and stress about things on a weekly basis. And I think we're seeing a national example of what really can happen to us internally. Something that struck me the other day that I think we're seeing vividly is how contagious anxiety is. And I truly believe, as contagious as COVID-19 is, the most contagious thing that we're experiencing right now, and I mean this, I'm thinking about my words carefully, this virus is contagious. It spreads quickly. I think even more so of what's spread through our country like a virus is worry. When I was 19, I played flag football in college. I so wish I could say that I played college football, but I played intramural flag football in college, and it happened in an instant. In a huddle after a play, my heart, it felt sort of like it just sort of stopped, and then started racing, beating fast and then slowing down. And so I ended up leaving the game and going to the hospital, and that began a pattern for about a month of doctors running tests and scans. About 3 to 5 or 6 times a day, randomly, my heart would just start this irregular, like fast, slow down. Felt like it was pounding. And in the middle of the testing, a doctor came back to me after a scan and said, "So, we're not sure. There appears on one of your scans to be the appearance of a small hole in your heart." I was like, "What? What? And what does that mean? Like, will it heal? Will that heal itself?" And he said, "No. If it's what it looks like on this scan, or where in the part of the heart, no, it wouldn't repair itself. We would have to repair it." And I said, "Like surgery?" And he said, "Yes." "Like open heart surgery?" "Yes, if we find out that that's what this is." And I just freaked out. And the scan couldn't happen, I think, until the next day. And then I didn't get the results for another day. So for the next 2 days, especially the first day, I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. It just consumed me. And then ironically, on the second day, the night of the second day, the night before I got the results, I had noticed at the doctor's office, which was right next to the hospital, that in front of the hospital in Winchester, across the parking lot, was a pond with what looked like a walking path to a little deck that sat just off the water. And so the second night of this whole stressful deal about a potential hole in my heart and open heart surgery, possibly, I ironically drove to the hospital to sit by the water and try to find some peace and talk to God about this. And I remember sitting there by the water, there was a bench on this little deck area, just telling God, "I don't get it. Like, are you close to me? I thought you were good," all of those kinds of things. I had this strongest sense. I'm going to say, like, God spoke to me. I didn't hear anything. It was like an awareness. It was like a very strong confidence or awareness. This understanding, Brad, I've got this no matter what? Do you trust that I have this and that I will do good no matter what the outcome is tomorrow? It wasn't, hey, Brad, there's no hole in your heart, so trust that. It was, no matter what the outcome is, do you trust that I'm working good in you? And, those are my words trying to describe this feeling or this sense. It was more of an awareness. And so I sat there and, it wasn't a quick yes, but I got to that point sitting on that bench that night where I said, God, I do. I do believe you are good. I do believe you only work good in people's lives. We talk at DCC a lot about how we live in a broken world. God didn't design this world to be broken. He designed it perfectly and to be good. Human beings break things when we make ourselves God. And that's the story early in Scripture, is that we broke creation. We broke this world when we replaced God with ourselves being God. And so we live in an imperfect, broken world. And the story of Jesus is one of God coming into this broken world to repair it, to remake it, to turn ugly into beautiful, to turn bad into good. And so even way back then in 1989, 1990, where I was in my faith, I did believe that about God. And I had that awareness that God will work good in my life no matter what a doctor says. And so the next day I go in and the doctor says, well, we still don't have a definitive answer to why your heart is beating irregularly. And he went on talking about these heart palpitations I was having. And I said, well, what about the hole? And he said, the hole? And I said, yeah, we've been waiting for the skin. And he said, oh, it was like he had forgotten, or at least that's the way I understood. He said, oh, no, there's no hole. Oh, I'm sorry. He apologized. He seemed so passive about it. No, it turned out to be the angle of the scan, or it was a shadow or something. And then he just dismissed it and just went on. And in an instant, my worry was over. At least that part of the worry of the open heart surgery. And I remember reading, and I can't find this article, a number of years ago I read that 90%, this was a scholastic study, like universities had studied this, 90% of what we worry about never happens. And so that is often the case. Often the case, we fill our minds, we fill our mouths. We fill our minds and our mouths with the what ifs. But what if this happens? And I get that good. It, I think, runs in my blood. I've said that. And I've had to learn how to counter that. I want to talk today about filling our minds and mouths with who God is, what He's done, and what He says. Even if the report ends up being what we don't want it to be. Even if the job we're concerned about losing, we actually lose. Even if the relationship continues to seem stressed, or we're not being loved the way that we want to be loved. I believe that if our worry actually happens, or some version of it, I want to talk about what do we do? How do we be anxious for nothing, as God tells us is really His plan for us? That's not an unrealistic statement, like He's just this God up in the sky who's so distant from us. He just says, I don't want you to ever worry about anything. What He's telling us is that His dream for us, His hope for us, is that we are people of confidence. We are people who speak peace. We speak hope. We speak life, not stress and not worry. Not only can our minds be overwhelmed with anxiety and worry, usually when that's the case, it comes out of our mouths. Our minds and mouths can either be filled with and speaking to others confidence and hope and truth and encouragement, or what our minds are filled with, the stress, the what ifs, what if this happens, will often come out of our mouths and affect others. We're actually spreading like a contagion, like a virus, worry and anxiety, which is what I think has happened to some degree in our country this week. So here's what I felt so strongly a couple of days ago that I'm supposed to put in front of you and ask you, what if the news comes back that there is, in fact, a small hole in your heart? What if you do get coronavirus? And I'm not suggesting you're going to. it's an exercise in, okay, where is God when that crappy day at work happens? Or the thing that kind of lingers in our head, like, what if ever a diagnosis hit my family, like it's happened to a friend of mine? Does that mean that God's just out of our lives, or we have no room for him? Scripture tells us, the story of God tells us that he's at work in that he's at work and he's working good in that. I wrote this long ago in my notes, and I say it at least once or twice a year to us, DCC, that anxiety is our body's sign that we've taken control away from God. If you have anxious tension in your body, it is a physical sign that you've taken control away from God. We fix that by thinking on who he is, what he's done, and what he says. When we focus our mind on who God is, what he's done, and what he said, we're pushing out the what ifs. And we're filling our minds with the confidence and the truth and the promises that God has for us. Psalm 112 says this. It talks about people of real trust in God. Not people who have perfect lives where nothing bad happens, but people who are confident in who God is, that they set their minds and hearts on who God is, the story of God, and what his words to them are. And it says that they will have no fear when bad news arrives. They will have no fear of bad news. And they're not pretending. God's not saying people who follow me pretend that everything's okay. That's a lot of what's a problem in religion today. At DCC, we have no interest in pretending. When life sucks, we want to say, man, life sucks right now. That's a part of community. That's a part of transparency. But I want to talk about how we can get to the point of living out as a pattern of our lives, even having peace and confidence when there's bad news. How does that happen? How do we explain it? It's because these people in Psalm 112, and it can be true for you, focus their minds and hearts on who God is, what he's done, and what he says. You might be surprised by this, but the most prevalent command in the Bible, the most common command in Scripture, you might think is like, don't sin, or be good, or I am holy, so you be holy, or something like that. The most common prevalent command in all of Scripture, all of God's story to us, is do not be afraid. Do not fear. Don't be afraid. Be anxious for nothing. Don't worry. Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. Cast your worries on me, Jesus says. It's been in my family, and my grandmother was the sweetest lady in the world, but it was obvious, and we knew it, all of our lives, that she was a chronic worrier. For me, the secret to combating worry, because we do get bad news. We do live in a world where there's uncertainty, and that's happening globally right now. We're a global community right now dealing with some uncertainty. My counter to these things have been replacing the voice in my head, the what ifs, with the actual voice or words of God, what he's told us. Focusing on who he is, focusing on what he's done, and focusing on what he says to us. And here's the second thing. The second thing isn't just focusing on what I listen to, but it's also what I say. I direct in anxious moments, when there's reason maybe to worry, there's concern, there's bad news, I will not just focus on what God has said to me, I will direct my words to him. And I'll say something like, here's an example. We have this sweet friend right now who's been diagnosed with cancer. She's a daughter, she's a sibling. I will say something like this to God. God, if one of my girls, or Amy, were diagnosed the same way, and I hope that never happens, God. That's a stressful thought. It's a thought I even hate considering. But God, if this friend that we're praying for right now, and that we want to be an encouragement to, if that were to happen to one of my girls, I wouldn't like it. I would honestly wish that wasn't part of the plan or part of their story, uh, but I trust you. And I trust that you would be in it. I trust that you would be in the situation and that you would be working good. You would be working on a story that would end up encouraging and giving life to others. Another one that I've said and tried to practice for years since starting this church is I love the people of this church. When I started this church, I said, I really believe I'm going to be here for life. I don't want to be moving and making that kind of change for people that I'm building relationships with. It's kind of a painful imagination or thought to lay it down, but often I've said, God, this church isn't mine. I love the people of the church. I love what I get to do, but it doesn't belong to me. The people who make up DCC do not belong to me. They belong to you. I'll say some version of, it's your work. I'm doing your plan. And if your plan were to change, if you ask me to lay it down, it's not mine to lay down. It's already yours, or some version of that. It's almost predictable. And I want to be careful here because I'm not talking about a formula, but it is a pattern I've noticed that when you honestly, genuinely say this kind of thing to God, like, God, wow, that would be hard to lay down, or that would be hard to say, I trust you in this situation. When those things are said genuinely to God, it's almost like that day or that week, I'll hear a story. Somebody will call me, or there'll be a new family that shows up. Our church will be growing. Our church has been growing with people that are coming in, some seeking God, some invited by a friend. And it's like God just says right back to you, thank you for trusting me. Thank you, Brad, for making this my story, my church, not yours. Now look at what I'm doing. Look at the work. Look at the good that I'm doing. If my girls, this is another kind of example, if my girls never influence anyone or never change the world or positively encourage a person, which is what I want most for my daughters. Maybe this isn't a good example. This is probably the easiest one to say yes to. Would I still love them? Would I still love my girls the same? I'll say this to God, of course. I mean, absolutely I would. I don't love them for what they do. I love them for who they are. Struggles or imperfections and great moments, tears, whatever's happening, I just love them for who they are. And I've noticed that when I say that to God, God, I don't ever want to pressure my girls. I don't want to be forcing them or pushing them into a direction or to be somebody they're not. When I offer that to God, I mean, it's like within a day or two or sometimes hours, I'll get a text message. Or one of the girls will call me and say, Dad, I've got a cool story. I just had this conversation and I was able to give somebody a different perspective, or somebody told me that I really encouraged them, Dad. And it's just this pattern that sets in. When we let go, we really see God at work. Another example, I'll just give one more. The film festival that I started 10 years ago, and that DCC has been such a big part of, and so many of you are a part of it. I remember receiving the first big sponsor check 10 years ago from a car company, and I had this kind of inner prompting, like, go talk to God about this. Keep your heart right about this. Would I walk away from this, God, if you ask me to? Would I just hand the film festival over to somebody? If Amy said, hey, Brad, our lives are busy, like, I just think you need to, let something go in the film festival, would I do it? And I remember with that first check, I immediately, when I sat down with God, this isn't mine. This festival isn't mine. This is your idea. You want to help children in need. You want to use movies to do that. This is your idea. Almost always when I have that kind of conversation with God, I'll just see some new way that God is using it to encourage somebody, or there's new momentum, and that's happening right now. The festival's being recognized in different places, and my job is to make sure that our team is encouraged and inspired and focused on the vision, and my job is to make sure that it's not mine, that it remains God's story, and He can do with it what He wants to do. I want to ask this question. Are you only good with God when life is good? Are you only good with God when life is good? Uh, Philippians chapter 4 is a letter in Scripture where this is part of the pattern, kind of the retraining of my mind. When I want to say, but what about, or what if this happens, I'll often go to Philippians 4. Be anxious about nothing, God says. Um, we internalize things when we're anxious, and inevitably it will come out of our mouths and will infect others with the negative, with the what ifs. Be anxious about nothing. Instead, be people who speak to God. What tempts you towards anxiety, what you're worried about, tell Him. Thank Him for the good in your life, Philippians 4 says. Make petitions to God. Tell Him your requests. And this is what will happen. The peace of God, which transcends all human understanding, like the peace that we so want. Everybody wants their kids to be healthy and happy. We just want to be happy. When people are surveyed all over the world, what's the number one priority of your life? Everybody says in every survey, I just want to be happy. I want my family to be happy. Real happiness that transcends anything that we can manufacture here humanly fills our hearts and minds. And we end up speaking life to others. This is getting kind of long for a video message. I want to ask, like, what if someone in your family contracted the virus? What if somebody at risk, like, I mean, does that mean God's not at work? God has no place in your life? Will you trust? Would you trust? Can you trust? Not blindly, not just because I'm telling you to, but because you've read, you've reminded yourself the story of God intervening in a broken world, in our broken lives, to bring about good always. Will you allow that conversation with God today? With the hysteria and the constant news, sometimes I just have to turn the news off just to sort of like just enjoy the silence. Like, can you spend some time today with all the worry and people's opinions turned off for a little while? And can you have that conversation with God? God, even if what I don't want to happen at work this year, or even if this stress about a relationship, or financially what could happen, or this virus, what's happening with this pandemic, even if it were to come into my home, will you help me see and remember who you are, what you've done, and what you've said to me? I want to give you a couple of tools. My brother wrote a plan, a daily reading plan. It takes 3 or 4 minutes to read. It can be found in the free app. Over 350 million people have downloaded the YouVersion app, YOU version. YouVersion is the free app. And if you click plans, there are all kinds of daily reading plans that encourage you in faith and encouraging us how to pray, how do we process things in life. My brother wrote one called From Anxiety to Peace, and his name is Brian Russell. You can search that way, From Anxiety to Peace by Brian Russell. And then another one that I think is really practical, and it's a new plan. I've just started it by N.T. Wright, one of my favorite writers and speakers. N.T. Wright wrote a plan that's on the YouVersion app called A Journey from Worry to Confident Hope, Praying Through the Lord's Prayer. And I've just begun that, and I invite you to join me in that. DCC, I love you. We're going to get through this. We're going to be stronger if we allow God to use this almost like practice. Like, okay, I'm going to block out the what ifs, and I'm going to focus on you. I'm going to focus on who you are, what you've done, what your words are to me. I know that we're actually going to grow stronger from this. We're going to grow spiritually and stronger and closer to God through this. And my challenge is that you just allow that. You allow, okay, God, you've allowed this pandemic. I believe you're in it. Grow me, grow my faith, my confidence in you. And I believe we're going to continue to speak life and hope and encouragement to so many people. I love you guys so much. I don't know when our doors will be open again. I hope next week. I'm not sure. It may be a couple of weeks, but we'll keep you updated every day or regularly. And if you're new to us, if you're watching in or listening for the first time, we would love you to join us in person or by podcast anytime. Come as you are. No perfect people allowed. Love you guys a lot. I'll talk to you soon.